Here we are again, the causes of World War One, Part 2. Such jazzy music. So, the song over there was written when the United States entered the war in 1917 to kind of let the global community know that we were coming to refresh everybody on the Allied side. So we were talking about trench warfare when we left off in the trenches. So you can see here, this is one side. Aircraft were used to warn of enemy attacks, but also to drop bombs on the no man's land. One of the other inventions from the late 1800s that caused a problem and caused the stalemate of World War I was the invention of barbed wire. Originally intended to sort of cordon off cattle out west, it got used during World War I in that no man's land zone. They would fill it with barbed wire so troops would get hung up on that as they tried to charge the other trenches. So one of the things that had to happen was artillery would be set up about 10 kilometers from the front lines, and their job was to fire into the no man's land and into the enemy trenches to try and break holes in those trenches and into the no man's land so that then the men coming out of the frontline trenches could charge across that no man's land and not get hung up and mowed down by the machine gunners. Oftentimes it wasn't very effective. Sometimes they also landed on their own troops if they did not get their coordinates correct. So here's a diagram of a trench in New Zealand. If you were lucky, you had a trench that had reinforced wood bottoms and sides. Here you can see some imagery of the British in their trenches, taking naps, resting whenever they could catch a little bit of sleep eye. You stuck your head over and there were snipers. Germans in the trenches. The forests were decimated by the artillery fire, but also forests provided cover, so they didn't want them. So there was a lot of environmental devastation in Europe at this time. Going over the top after the artillery fire, your captain would say, going over the top and charge, and you would launch up and out and into no man's land and try to take the enemy trenches. Really, no territory was gained this way. Most often it would be a few hundred yards to a few miles that might be gained. And you can see for the duration of the war here, because of the mass production of death and industrialized warfare, these trenches just got longer. You would just try to outmaneuver on the sides and flank your enemies, and that just caused us to have huge amounts of trenches. Again, another aerial photo of the trenches, and you can see the conditions in the trenches were typically wet and muddy, and the biggest issue in the trenches was trench foot. If your feet are wet for a considerable amount of time, they literally start to rot, which can lead to infections and can cause you to die. So in fact, at home, women were encouraged to knit socks in large quantities and send them overseas. Here you can see these gentlemen in these trenches. They're just wet and muddy in the spring and in the winter and the fall, pretty much all the time. They were also infested with rats, which carried all kinds of nasty diseases. We've studied that before when we talked about the plague. And they were large, and you would be trying to sleep, and they would show up and start nibbling on your rations or your smelly socks or your boots. So people started taking to hunting them in the trenches. Then you had the introduction of a new weapon in the form of chemical weapons. Mustard gas and chlorine gas were used on the battlefield. Early in the war, men did not actually have issued gas masks, and so when these initial gas attacks started, men would urinate on their handkerchiefs and cover their nose to protect themselves from these gas attacks. Later, it was common issue. Everyone got a gas mask, and they would ring a bell when a gas attack would happen, and you would be expected to put on your gas mask as quickly as possible. Gas masks were made for horses as well as the dogs that were on the field. You would have these long stretches of boredom between spurts of intense activity with artillery bombardment and charging over the top. You could just sit around and sew your shirts. So this becomes known as a total war because it was industrialized and mechanized and it had a foot in 2 centuries. Military leaders were not prepared for the tragic outcomes of these weapons, but they used old battle strategies that are really from Roman times. They needed industrial support. They needed to maintain fuel lines, supply lines, food, ammunition for this massive effort, and so entire societies were mobilized. Whether a nation was democratic or not, the nations that became involved implemented these huge national efforts to coordinate the war that became pretty totalitarian in nature and dictatorial. People were expected to ration food, even at home. In the United States, people were expected to grow what they called victory gardens, grow your own vegetables so that the rest of the farming food could be sent to our soldiers overseas. People were expected to enlist and participate. New weapons in the war, the Browning machine gun, which was water-cooled, fired 450 to 500 rounds a minute. Poison gas was first used in 1914 by the French, and so gas masks were needed for all the soldiers. It was one of the greatest fears of soldiers. It was very deadly. Tanks were first used in 1916, but not super effectively. They broke down a lot and got stuck, so they weren't perfected. German U-boats and submarines were used really effectively in the North Atlantic. The Germans used unrestricted submarine warfare on what they considered supply ships in the North Atlantic, and they would even attack neutral U.S. ships, which was one of the things that ultimately dragged the United States into the war. Airplanes were first used for observation, and then pilots were dropping bombs at each other. Later, once they figured out the timing so that you wouldn't shoot your own propeller off, they figured out how to mount machine guns on them. The U.S. entered the war after the Germans sank our ship, the Lusitania, and also wrote a letter to the Mexicans encouraging the Mexicans to invade the United States. The United States intercepted that letter and declared war on Germany after that. We were a set of fresh troops, and we sort of tipped the scales towards the Allies and are able to defeat a very weary Europe. And then on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, which is November 11th, in 1918, an armistice or a peace was called, and the war and fighting was called to a halt, and then all of the parties agreed to meet at Versailles to negotiate a peace treaty. The treaty that gets negotiated and the peace talks happen at Versailles, Louis XIV's palace that we've studied, and the Germans were not invited. The Austria-Hungarian Empire had collapsed and was no longer in existence. The Ottoman Empire collapsed and was no longer in existence. So really, the only people left at the table were the Allies. At this point, Russia is out of the war as well, because in 1917, they had their own revolution happening within their country, and so they had backed out a bit. So basically, the Allies decide that Germany, since there is no Austria-Hungary anymore and no Ottoman Empire anymore, that Germany is the sole person left standing to be held responsible for the war. And they are forced, through the treaty, to pay for the entire cost of the war, which is known as paying war reparations. This was viewed as very unfair by the Germans, rightfully so. The Germans were also forced to give up territory that they had acquired both during the war and prior to the war to force them down to a smaller, more manageable size. And they were forced to dismantle their army and their navy. Literally, they had to go out into the North Atlantic and torpedo their own naval ships. It's called scuttling ships. And then they were forced to officially and publicly take responsibility for starting the war. Now, if you're a German citizen, this does not sit well with you, especially because from your perspective, you weren't the only person that started this. But you're the only person left standing, so there's no one else to blame, and we didn't invite you to the table, so you don't get to decide. Austria-Hungary no longer exists. So, the legacy of the war. Why did we end up in another world war when this was supposed to be the war to end all wars? Well, Germany's mad. And then a Great Depression starts, and you'll see how that plays out too. How did the events of World War I lead to oppression? What happened to the people within these nations? How do we remember very difficult histories? How do we, as a society, look at that? How do we memorialize these things and these events? World War I had huge casualties, and it really sets us up for World War II. The Allies suffered the most casualties, but no nation was really immune in Europe. An entire generation of men becomes known as the lost generation. These are workers. Their impacts and their death and injury has huge impacts on economies in Europe at this time. Men also came back with psychological issues that at the time were called shell shock. Today we know it as PTSD, and people were expected to stuff it and not show it, and so they self-medicated most often with morphine and alcohol. So we will look later at how this leads us to the period between World War I and World War II and the rise of Adolf Hitler. Have a lovely day.